Peterborough, Ontario, a city with over 84,000 residents proud to call this place their home. A century ago, the people of Peterborough referred to this place as the Electric City, and although that was based on merits of the economy at the time, when you experience what the city has to offer today, you realize there is a deeper meaning behind that name. The passion and pride people from Peterborough feel about their hometown races like a jolt of electricity from generation to generation. And at the core of this lies the rich history of sport and recreation. This city's passion for sport has carried for decades, and today there is a wide selection of opportunities for kids of varying ages to participate in sport or recreational activities. However, just as an electric current has both positive and negative charges, so too does the participation of sport. On the positive side, you can make friends, be physically active, and learn valuable lessons about teamwork and discipline. Conversely, on the negative side, there is an inherent risk associated with participation, and one that students, parents, teachers, and coaches all need to understand, as it has a direct impact on the quality of life of our youth population. On this Rowan's Law Day, we will be taking a deep dive into the severity of concussions and the different ways it can impact your life, even if you've never experienced one. Throughout this video, we'll be hearing from athletes, students, coaches, teachers, practitioners, and researchers to gain a deeper understanding of this invisible injury by highlighting 4 key areas associated with experiencing a concussion: recognize, remove, manage, and prevent. A concussion is often referred to as an invisible injury because, unlike a broken bone or a common cold, where you can identify that something is wrong with the person, when it comes to a brain injury, the symptoms are harder to notice and can fall on a wide spectrum that looks different for each man, woman, or child that experiences one.
Couldn't explain what was going on, and my hands would shake, I couldn't stop them from shaking.
I was starting to just experience headaches after short times of reading.
A lot of cognitive decelerations and sensitivity to light and noise.
I'd have an immediate headache. Some of them, my vision would just go blurry.
In the past decade, research on concussions has rapidly evolved, but there is still so much ambiguity involved with recognizing this injury, which makes it crucial for us to understand how to properly identify the signs and symptoms of concussion. In 2018, the Government of Canada released nationwide statistics related to concussion, and based off these numbers, it became apparent that most Canadians lack a general understanding towards the complex nature associated with this invisible injury. As a result, 50% of concussions today go undiagnosed, and this can be quite detrimental to a country that is seeing the number of injuries rise in their youth demographic on a yearly basis. In fact, according to the nationwide statistics that the Canadian government released, approximately 46,000 concussions occurred between the ages of 5 and 19 years of age in Ontario alone. Evidently, these numbers exist, and we know that this injury is affecting the lives of kids and young adults each year. Then why is there still a substantial number of concussions going undiagnosed? Well, the answer to this question is not simple, and recognizing a concussion comes with many challenges along the way, beginning with the misconception that most people have when they only associate this injury with major collisions in sports.
From my experience, I think most of the head injuries I've seen didn't come from a head-to-head collision. It was a knock where the player fell back and maybe bumped their head on the ground.
Understanding the various ways you can receive a concussion is vital in the recognizing phase of this injury, especially because you don't need to experience direct contact to your head to receive one.
Concussions are caused by a blow to the head, face, neck, or body from a fall, a hit, or anything that knocks someone with enough force that their brain moves around inside their skull.
This means that concussions don't just occur as a result of direct force to the brain, but rather from any contact that jars the head, leading to a large percentage of concussions occurring outside of sport participation.
I was going down a hill and hit a bump. Handlebars kind of went sideways and I fell down, and I was wearing a helmet, but I hit the side of my head.
In fact, of the 46,000 diagnosed concussions that occurred in the youth demographic, it was estimated that between 27 to 44% of them resulted from a sport-related incident. So, by not understanding the full extent of how concussions occur, we fall into barriers within our approach of recognizing if a student has sustained one. These barriers present a challenge for medically trained staff as well, and as the athletic therapist for the Peterborough Petes, Natasha Lagasse has a practical understanding of the complex nature associated with recognizing a concussion, since it is one of her main responsibilities to identify if her athletes have experienced any signs and symptoms of the injury. However, being in this environment brings with it an additional challenge Natasha has to navigate through in this stage of the injury.
Depends on if I've seen it or if I haven't, but typical ones are what I see in a lot of hockey is the constant head shaking, like trying to shake it off.
This shake it off mentality has been embedded in sports culture and is still present today, which makes it harder to diagnose a concussion in real time.
I'd like get up and I'd be like, where am I? Oh, okay, there's a game going on, like get back into it.
As a result, medical trainers like Natasha have to look for specific indicators to help them identify if their athletes are in fact experiencing concussion symptoms.
First of all, knowing your athlete is huge. So knowing if they are a little bit off put, you just notice your athlete is going a different spot in a play that they're supposed to be going one way versus the other. That kind of thing, like just small, they're not playing as they usually would. They're not communicating as they usually would. They look just completely dazed and confused.
On top of this, Natasha has to navigate through the fact that there are varying degrees associated with this injury.
Symptoms aren't always immediate. So you could have a hit or not even have a hit to your head, be fine, and then half an hour, 2 hours later, 24 hours later, start developing symptoms. Someone would just brush it off thinking, I'm tired or I'm just dehydrated.
This means that for some people, their symptoms can appear right at the moment of impact, making it easy to recognize the signs of the concussion immediately.
As soon as it happened, it was kind of a moment of, that wasn't good.
But in other cases, the symptoms can be delayed, creating a disassociation with the cause of their pain and leaving individuals confused as to why they feel different.
Didn't really think too much about it at the time, but after you go to the doctor and realize, I have a really big headache and I can't really see, you realize there's an issue going on.
It was just a whole lot of I couldn't eat, I couldn't keep food down, and just not being able to focus and not being able to sleep either. So it just got progressively worse.
It is this ambiguity related to concussions that can lead to multiple barriers associated with recognizing the injury, and it would be a lot easier if there was technology that could help practitioners identify the injury. However, even though technology has advanced beyond new heights in recent years, when it comes to our brains and trying to recognize a concussion, there is still so much we have yet to uncover.
I think that's an important piece, is that we don't have any scans, we don't have any blood work, we don't have any tests for concussion.
What Dr. Dallaire is alluding to here is the fact that we still don't have a true biomarker to help identify a concussion, which means there is an element of self-assessment required in recognizing the injury. Even so, due to the unpredictable nature associated with concussions, this can be a daunting task, and oftentimes, young athletes will end up hiding their symptoms in order to continue playing the game they love.
The fact that, athletes are going to lie. They want to stay on the field. I did it myself as a rugby player. I don't know how many times I lied to my coach and my AT, being like, no, I was fine, I'm fine. I just brush it off.
I had a tournament coming up out west for Team Ontario box cross. And I was like, I really want to play. I'm pretty stubborn, so I didn't really want to not play. It was my last year to do it. So decided to get on a plane. I said I was fine, went and saw a doctor. I was like, no, I'm fine.
Even when they told me to take a shift off, I'd be like, no, I'm fine. I can go back out. We got to win the game.
You're kind of internalizing, you want to get back to play and everything, and you kind of just want to say that you're fine, but deep down you know that you're not. There's a lot of fear, just because there's such a stigmatism behind concussions.
It is this experience of stigma that Hannah mentions, which reinforces the mentality behind athletes playing through pain, and leads to another reason as to why so many concussions go undiagnosed. The problem with this mindset, however, is that when it comes to our brains, we are putting ourselves at an extreme risk if we don't recognize the injury in its early stages.
It literally could be life or death if they miss something and, end up going back out on the field, on the rink, whatever their sport, going on their day-to-day and happen to get hit again while they're recovering, there's a huge, huge possibility for second impact syndrome, which, as we know, for Rowan's law, that's exactly what happened.
The tragic story of Rowan Stringer sent ripples into the entire sport and medical communities in Canada and our country's approach to concussion management. After sustaining 2 concussions in the span of 5 days while playing rugby back in 2013, Rowan passed away as a result of second impact syndrome. Since this tragedy, Ontario has made some incredible strides in awareness and education on concussions at a high school level. And Rowan's story serves as a constant reminder for the severity of this injury and the importance of communicating any symptoms you may be experiencing.
Have the courage to communicate that is such a key thing for concussions, of just being like, hey, I'm still not okay, and need to express those feelings and thoughts to coaching staff and doctors and not hide it.
In the end, yes, you're a student athlete, but student first, then athlete. It's something that you need to do to protect yourself.
Between the various symptoms associated with concussion, the different durations of onset symptoms, and the stigma linked to this invisible injury, many concussions end up going undiagnosed, which is why it's essential to communicate any challenges you're experiencing so that others can help you recognize the injury.
Just tell someone, preferably someone who's an adult, who can get you directed to the right treatment that you need. And then, don't be scared of admitting it as well. Don't hesitate to tell a coach just because you're going to get pulled. It's going to suck because either you're getting pulled for one game or you could never play that sport again. Kind of a gamble that you don't really want to take with your brain.
There's just nothing else like a brain injury. There's lots of injuries to your body, but the brain is the center core of operating, your whole body for your whole life.
Our brain has billions of neurons that combine to make trillions of connections responsible for our everyday function. Yet we often neglect the importance of giving our brain the proper rest it deserves. The challenge that comes with removal from play is an obstacle that is present for athletes of all sports, and there are various reasons that could lead to a player pushing through their symptoms in order to stay in the game.
There's a lot of athletes in their teens are looking for scholarships, right? So they're pushing for academics. There could be a scout in the stand. There could be somebody there to watch them. And by all means, they don't want to stop if they've taken a knock after 10 minutes, right? They'll play through anything because they feel like a future is on the line for them.
Having addressed the challenges of recognizing a concussion previously, we know that identifying this invisible injury is hard. And as the head trainer of the Peterborough Petes, Brian Miller has learned the importance of taking a more proactive approach with athletes that may have a suspected head injury.
Personally, I put a lot of stock into just having a conversation with the athlete, right? How are they interacting with me? How is their concentration, in a conversation? If there seems to be any question, let's just, pull them off. Let's get them out of that game environment and have that conversation, to start with, and then possibly, further assessment stuff accordingly.
Brian has been around young hockey athletes since the early 2000s. And even with his 2 decades of experience in the medical field, he still encounters challenges during this phase of removal.
It's not always necessarily obvious. Sometimes it's a lot more subtle. So you've got to kind of look for basically a change in performance, a change in behavior, and sometimes that's indicated by their teammates.
Acknowledging the role teammates can play in this process is critical, since they are usually the ones who see the individual the most.
You know that person, you know how they act, you know how they play. You're their family. And so you see something going up with them, something that's even a little bit off, tell somebody.
Grace Sanderson has played rugby her whole life, and although she's never personally experienced a concussion, some of her closest friends and family members have.
It's hard, right? You don't want to be that teammate that goes and tattles or tells to the coaches or to the trainer that, listen, I think so-and-so has a concussion. They need to be removed from play or something needs to happen. But ultimately, it's for the betterment of that player. And so if you truly suspect somebody has concussion and they're refusing to go seek help for it, you need to tell a trainer, you need to tell a coach, you need to tell their parents.
As a teammate, it's hard to carry that weight of responsibility for your friend's removal. But understanding the significance of this role and how it can help them is essential, although the challenges don't end there. And for many athletes, getting removed from their sport can take its toll on other aspects of their life.
So many intricacies that play, especially in team sports, because you get to a certain level and if you're not performing, you're not dressing. You get to a certain level and if you're injured, it's so hard to come back into the team at that same level that you left with.
This was certainly the case for 2016 Rio Olympic bronze medalist Hannah Darling, who suffered a concussion while playing in a game for the Canadian rugby development team.
It was devastating to me just because I didn't know how long I was going to play. I didn't know if I was going to lose a spot. It's a lot of, I don't know. And then just being away from rugby, it's tough because that's what I wanted to do. That's what I was being trained to do, was play rugby, and just kind of feeling that you're falling behind because you're not training every single day. And you kind of worry about what's happening to your body and just wondering when can I get back out there? When can I get back out there? But then second guessing yourself, you're am I all right?
This I don't know mentality Hannah is referring to doesn't just impact the athlete, but also the medical staff assessing the individual.
There are no cookie cutter answers as far as, how long is the athlete going to be out? I can't tell you. What I can tell you is what's happening right now here today, what our game plan will be, and how we'll keep updating you and communicating with you as far as the process goes.
The ambiguity surrounding the recovery process can bring its own set of stress and mental health complications. And this is where a coach can really step up in the return to play process by reassuring their athletes on the importance of prioritizing their health.
For me, it's more, let's err on the side of caution. Let's see what's really going on here. Let's have a look at it. The players will tell you, I'm okay, give me a couple more minutes, let's do this. And I think it's just best to stop, reset, assess the situation, and see really if there is something wrong.
Having this approach to removal is pivotal, and research indicates athletes who continue to play through their concussions took twice as long to recover than those who were removed immediately. Unfortunately, the reality is not all coaches are capable of providing that sense of reassurance that Scott Coburn does. And as a parent, you are entrusting them with the responsibility and safety of your kids.
I think the relationship between the parent and the coach is very important. It needs to be a trustful relationship because I'm entrusting you with my child and to take care of him and to ensure his safety while on the ice.
Amy Schwanda is a mother of 2 kids that love to play sports, and she understands the level of trust she has to give coaches to ensure her kids' safety. However, because of the complex nature associated with concussion, if that coach doesn't have a comprehensive understanding of the injury, it could lead to a number of concussions being missed at all levels of play.
It was when he was so sensitive to the noise that I kind of picked up on it and I thought maybe he has a concussion, but coaches are telling me that no, he's fine. So I felt kind of guilty not being aware of that first one he got, and he continued to play, and that accelerated his second concussion.
Amy's concern is valid, and the personal guilt she experienced with her son's injury is a result of a failed team approach to concussion management. The same can be said, on the other hand, where these roles are reversed. And in Scott's experience as a soccer coach, he's had to deal with parents that were upset because of their kids' removal.
Sometimes with young athletes, the parents can be the toughest factor because they don't want their own kid to stop because the parents are invested in the winning culture as well too. So I think that's where it becomes important to talk to them, see how they're feeling, assess them, pull them out. But it can be difficult taking an athlete away from the game for a quick rest or a test and having the parents, my kid has to get back in there. We have to win this game.
It is this tricky dynamic between the coach, parent, and athlete that often creates a lot of tension in the overall removal process.
The coach, will definitely have concern for their athlete and want them back as part of the team and helping the team going towards that goal of winning. And, the parents probably more so about the long-term health of their child. But again, the more everybody is educated about it, the better.
To Brian's point, education is an essential component that helps with the long-term health of athletes by ensuring they are removed from play. Removing the athlete when we've recognized the injury is critical for the overall recovery process, and evidently, so is having an ecosystem of support that prioritizes the health and safety of the individual.
It's better to be proactive, go that extra step, even if it turns out to be nothing, right? Like nobody's ever going to be mad for saying, hey, listen, you're probably right, I should go sit out. And worst case scenario, it's nothing, and they're perfectly fine. Best case scenario, you have just saved them a whole lot of world of hurt.
The things that I felt like I did was getting myself educated on what a concussion was. And that was empowering for me as a parent to know everything that I can about it.
I would have a hard time living with myself if I didn't pull a player out and something went seriously wrong, where they were hospitalized or even worse.
The overall health of the player is always the number one thing. And, as everybody knows, you only got one brain, right? It's not a knee, it's not a joint. You got one, and it's part of our commitment as health providers to, use the knowledge that we have, the assessments that we have, and try and make the best decision that we feel for the long-term health of the athletes.
Once the injury has been recognized and the person has been removed from any activities that could risk aggravating their symptoms, the next step for the individual is to manage their recovery journey. However, the individualized nature of this process makes the approach different for everyone. When looking at the story of Caleb Duquetto, who suffered his concussion the summer going into his final year of high school, the struggles he experienced when returning to learn were extremely difficult to manage.
Found just going into this school and all the lights and all the people around was really overwhelming and caused me to have a headache after a short time.
What Caleb experienced is not uncommon and is a result of the non-linear process that recovering from a brain injury is often associated with.
Sometimes you feel like I'm almost there. And then a few days later, you'll be right back where you were a month ago.
According to the American Psychological Association, this means that there isn't a step-by-step process to guide an individual, but rather, it's a process that is based on continual growth, occasional setbacks, and experiential learning, which is something that family physician Dr. Steph Dallaire is conscious of when he works to help kids and teens recover from a concussion.
Put on top of that, the social component. When am I going to catch up on that exam? Did I lose my starting position? All of those weigh into the anxiety and depression.
The challenges students and young athletes face go beyond managing just their concussion symptoms, as the recovery process can also impact one's mental health as well.
Having to take breaks from things is hard in itself. Sometimes people think oh, no school, that's great. But yeah, not being able to really see anybody or really do anything, that was super hard.
Caleb is not alone in facing these challenges. In fact, according to the National Institute of Health, approximately 1 in 5 individuals may experience mental health symptoms up to 6 months after receiving a mild traumatic brain injury, otherwise known as a concussion.
That's why we want to get people back to class, back on the field, back on the ice. Back in the change room is actually more important, okay? And knowing where your boundaries are, at first, maybe it's 10 minutes, and after that, it's that sound is too much, the lights are too bright, I can't do this. But we also want to support them and have them around. That goes a long way with the mental health components.
As Dr. Dallaire mentions, showing support for someone with a concussion can really help them manage their mental health throughout the recovery journey. And this supportive approach might be more important than we realize.
You need to pull that person to every team event, even if they can only last for 5 minutes. Just make them feel that they're on the team, make them feel welcome, make them feel, that they're still there.
Mike Keating grew up playing hockey with the late Steve Montador, and saw firsthand what multiple concussions did to his childhood friend.
After seeing, a best friend go through what he went through mentally, it would be, you can't put yourself in the person's shoes. You don't have any idea what they're thinking. And then as soon as they stop caring about themselves, they don't know they're not caring about anyone else. So that's a really, really tough thing to go through, especially as, being so close to someone.
The various challenges that an individual experiences throughout the recovery process can be difficult to manage and often alienates them from their teammates and classmates, which is something Laura Young encountered during her recovery.
I did approach one of my best friends when I had severe anxiety and depression and just told her that I needed her. And she told me that they don't have time to check in on me anymore, that they're too busy doing other things and getting to know other people. And I will never, ever forget that.
It is this lack of understanding at a peer-to-peer level that can accentuate one's mental health complications and leave them feeling more isolated than ever before.
That age group is really interesting because there's not always that understanding of what the injury is. You see all kinds of people have big hits in sports and then get up and be fine. And then you have someone who has, a milder, what looks like a milder impact or injury, who have significant symptoms. And friends often don't understand.
Vice Principal Nunzella Hobson believes we can change the perception peers have towards this injury, and it starts by normalizing these conversations at school.
That if we normalize having those conversations, then their peers will understand that, okay, the school has recognized this, they have protocols around this, and therefore I need to be much more supportive to my peers.
Talking about concussions in a school environment is integral for the destigmatization of this invisible injury. But the conversation can't end here. There also needs to be accountability in the community, and Mike understands just how important it is to support someone with a concussion, which is why, alongside other childhood friends, they launched HOPE in Peterborough.
We came up with HOPE, helping others participate equally, because all we want to do is kind of give back to our community.
One of the incredible things HOPE has established in Peterborough is an annual Steve Montador Scholarship for students recovering from a concussion, one that Caleb received last year.
Being chosen for that is really special. Not only the money element of it, but also it was just a boost to know that people care.
That's what the scholarship's for, to help these kids, pursue what they want, whatever goal that is, obviously a post-secondary education, and make it easier.
Research actually supports this community approach in Peterborough and suggests that social support may play a positive role in concussion recovery and help with anxiety, community integration, and validation towards this invisible injury.
Students who don't have that type of support around them are at a higher risk of having those prolonged symptoms. So we know how important that is.
When we magnify the experience of a student returning to a school environment, we learn that support is an essential component to managing the recovery, and the role teachers can play to help with this is crucial.
They know that student's baseline. They know what they normally can produce and what they are like prior to an injury, and they will try and fill in the gap and allow that student that latitude, that space in order to start to heal and be able to come back to that learning space as healthy as possible.
Teachers have a huge role on all three, social, academic, and athletics, right? So they're a set of very valuable eyes to both parents and to a physician as to where are we at? How are things going?
While managing their return to learn, students will often require accommodations based on their symptom threshold. But this can bring its own form of stigmatization because oftentimes their peers don't understand why they are receiving special treatment.
When you're at school, having to take breaks is kind of humiliating because people may not understand exactly how you're feeling.
I was also exempt from my exams in high school because my headaches were so severe that I wasn't able to sit that long for a test. And I'll never forget one of my best friends saying to me, "Oh, I really wish I was you. You're so lucky you're getting out of this." And I remember just going and crying and thinking, I would trade your life any day for mine because the pain I go through every day is not worth writing one exam.
The accommodation piece is vital. On day 2 of a significant concussion, you can't go write an exam. That's not fair. And it's not actually measuring what your knowledge is.
The truth is, measuring a student's capabilities after they've experienced a concussion is a big challenge our educational system faces. But Vice Principal Hobson explains that there are ways in which the school environment can evolve in their assessment.
Assess achievement in multiple ways. You don't have to use every way. And so reducing, monitoring, and honoring the fact that the student may or may not be able to function at the same level for a week, 2 weeks, and that's okay.
So when we look at the different components of a student's recovery, an important thing to understand is how to manage the stress one encounters throughout the non-linear process.
Identify, what are my worries? And it's hard to do that sometimes. Like, what am I actually stressed about? And you can write them down. I'm worried about my academics. I'm worried about this exam. I'm worried that this project in particular, because maybe that works into that big plan of, okay, let's problem solve here. What is reasonable and not reasonable?
As a result, it becomes quite difficult to create an ideal management strategy for a person dealing with the injury, as our approach is constantly evolving and has to change on a case-by-case basis.
You have to push it a little bit. That helps with that recovery. So day one, you take it easy. Day two, if you're feeling up to it, you get on a treadmill and you walk for 15 minutes and you see how that goes. And you don't push it. And if it feels good, you don't keep going, you stop. But the next day we're like, hey, that went pretty well and my symptoms weren't aggravated too much. So you don't just lay on the couch and do nothing for 5 days. That's not helpful, and you're gonna be hindered.
So whether we're managing our own recovery process or helping others with a concussion, it's important to remember.
Really honor the fact that you have an injury, that a brain injury really truly is something that has happened to you, and that you need to honor the fact that you need time to heal.
Talk to your friends about how you're feeling. Just do it. It's amazing how much that can help this type of thing.
How do you feel today? That's all you have to ask. And they'll tell you. It goes a long way. Absolutely. That one line I probably used on Monty a million times. So it's one of those things where you really need to listen, I feel.
Learning how to recognize a concussion, understanding when to remove an athlete from play, and identifying strategies to manage their symptoms throughout the recovery journey are essential components to creating a safer environment in sport. However, even though our understanding concerning the severity of concussions continues to grow, the question that many still have is, how can we prevent concussions from ever happening in the first place? To find the answer to this question, we must first address the 3 different types of concussion prevention: primary, secondary, and tertiary. To put it simply, when we talk about primary prevention, we're often referring to the different ways we can aim to prevent a concussion before they occur.
So we want to understand how concussions happen, who they happen to, and then how can we prevent those incidents from happening.
The approach to creating an environment in sport that is conducive to preventing a concussion is not a simple task. In order to create sustainable preventative measures, we need to start by addressing the most important question related to primary prevention: who is responsible for making these decisions?
I think ultimately the responsibility falls on the governing bodies of sport to do more about concussion. Ultimately, it comes down to who is making the decisions and who is influencing the culture the most, and every time it's going to be them.
Where this responsibility can become problematic is when you begin to factor in the various stakeholders associated with influencing the final decision-making process.
For a long time, sport organizations have been able to mark their own homework. They're the ones who are in charge of deciding what's safe and what's not. They're the ones who say, well, this is the risk that we're allowing within our sport. Which is kind of weird if you think about it, especially at the professional level. If I'm in a job, I need to be informed of the risks of that job. And if I'm going to get harmed in that, I want to know that the organization is going to help me out. But then there's also stakeholders.
and shareholders and fans, spectators, all this money involved in this. And you're saying the people who are in charge of the money also in charge of deciding the rules.
Mike Jorgensen has dedicated his entire PhD to understanding the intricacies of concussion prevention, and the paradox that he illustrates here raises a number of concerns in the approaches of governing bodies to create preventative measures related to concussions in sport.
There also has to be structure in leagues and sporting organizations where there is a level of accountability. And I think right now what we see in some organizations and some sporting organizations, there's accountability for some aspects that oversee the leagues, and then there's gray areas where there's not necessarily anything that the governing body can do to hold accountability in some areas.
Holding governing bodies accountable can lead to immediate changes in our current policies and procedures in sport. And from Laura's experience working in the concussion landscape for over a decade, she believes this begins with having an open dialogue with the administration in charge of making these decisions.
Where I feel like we really need to challenge our leagues and our organization is how we shift culture, how we talk to our players about what's acceptable and what's not, and how we really have to lean into those hard conversations. Because if we're not willing to have those hard conversations, we're never going to be able to impact change.
Challenging the decision makers accountable for making these changes through open conversation is a great start for initiating much-needed dialogue surrounding concussion prevention in sport. But taking it a step further requires us to have a deeper understanding of how the hierarchy of decision-making already influences sport culture.
Who creates those systems? So if you look at the very highest level, it's sport organizations or sport governing bodies create these systems. And then underneath that, there's individual sport organizations, and then there's coaches, parents, and unfortunately for athletes, they are at the bottom.
Ryan Sutton recently completed his master's thesis with the intention of gaining a deeper understanding on the sport-related concussion experience. And one of the glaring problems he noticed from his research is how much influence the current system in place has on an athlete's identity and well-being.
And you see it all over the world where it's like the decisions of the top groups influence the people who are directly on the other end of that decision. So with concussions or with sport, the hegemonic masculine value system was created by the people who govern sport. And it was a way to create a never-ending cycle of athletes who are going to want to aspire to get to the highest level of performance. The one thing that there sometimes can be a disconnect with is the actual health of the athletes. When there's such an emphasis on the output of what they can actually create, the health of an athlete can be put to the wayside.
Where this top-down approach gets even more controversial, how decisions from the top group has the ability to influence the characteristics and values athletes embody at a young age.
So there's a concept related to stigma, which talk about how stigma is created by the dominant perspective. And those dominant perspectives are typically formed at the highest levels, the top-down approach. And the way that coaches, parents, sport administrators actually talk about being an athlete and what is involved with being an athlete directly influences the way that these athletes embody those traits and values.
The current value system that is in place has influenced the perspective athletes have on sustaining injuries. And Mike Jorgensen highlights a recent study that provides evidence of this theory with rugby players.
There's some research on rugby players in particular where their main concern wasn't that they were injured, it was that their injury prevented them from competing.
Where Mike believes we can change this narrative is how we communicate the values and risks associated with participation.
What are we promoting? Why are we playing the sport? What is the motive there? And can we shift that? And so it's not just a culture of awareness, it's a culture of understanding risk, where we find acceptable levels of risk, and why we even engage in that risk in the first place.
The culture surrounding sport is in need of shifting its overall structure, and given our understanding of the current decision-making hierarchy, we must broaden our ideas surrounding the scope of responsibility for creating preventative measures and have them built into every aspect that influences sport behaviors.
The bigger picture, the bigger system, it's not just the athletes, it's everything sort of working together.
because any one situation, any one approach probably isn't enough. And we see that in the research. Education, just being knowledgeable on concussions doesn't change behaviors. But when you combine that with policy, when you combine that with support networks, when you combine that with positive media messaging around that, like all this stuff sort of works together to build that rather than one single thing.
On the positive side, Canada has seen major strides in its concussion policy over the years. Stephanie Cowell, the Director of Knowledge Translation at Parachute, the leading injury prevention organization in the country, has played a key role in creating pivotal concussion prevention materials on a national scale.
I mean, some of the accomplishments, first of all, establishing the first ever Canadian guideline on concussion in sports, creating a simple go-to evidence-based source of information that various organizations can use. Being involved with and seeing the evolution of the Concussion Harmonization Project and concussion protocols and policies and education in this country is by far one of the proudest things I've ever been part of in my career.
These changes have created a strong framework for a more collaborative effort in the overall concussion knowledge and awareness supported by our country. But it took key milestones for Canada to get to this point.
There were some really important things that fed into this moment in our country. In 2015, we saw concussion appear as part of the federal health and sport minister mandates. That was important because it became a higher priority with government. It came with some resources to do the work and a commitment by a lot of different partners to be able to do the work at the national level.
This catalyst led to the funding of the Concussion Harmonization Project, which was the most significant collaborative effort towards concussions from a national level this country has ever seen.
We saw over about 3 years of funded project work with the Harmonization Project. We saw more than 50 national sport organizations working on harmonized, evidence-based concussion protocols. National organizations are now required by Sport Canada to have concussion policies and protocols in place. That's a first in Canada.
However, even with all of this amazing growth in concussion education, there were still key areas that were not being addressed.
There's two key components to that comprehensive approach to concussion that haven't been so prominent. And those two areas are preventing the injury from happening in the first place, and the other aspect is surveillance.
Not having proper surveillance in sport raises a deeper concern, as this measurement is not only essential for ensuring the safety of athletes.
Injury surveillance, you can't fix what you don't measure, right? And it's really hard then at the individual level when individuals aren't reporting.
But can also provide important data to help inform our decisions on future preventative measures.
Having good quality data to understand what injuries are happening and how, getting context, and those two are intimately related. So we want prevention efforts to be driven by data and evidence. So building out better surveillance, having better data about what's happening to cause concussion in sport, implementing targeted prevention that addresses those causes, and then continuing to collect data and information to understand, is the prevention making a difference? It's all a cycle.
Having the proper measurements in place to create this cycle that Stephanie mentions is imperative and can lead to further discoveries on preventative approaches that we can implement to create a safer sport environment. Throughout all of this, it is evident that there are various gaps in primary prevention, and this all leads back to where the accountability lies from a top-down approach. So now that we have a collective understanding, the next step is for action.
But if we really want to change our sporting culture and really prevent these injuries from happening in the first place, we have to start talking about it. I believe that there's a quote that when you know better, you do better. And I think that's where we are. We know better. We know that we can put things in place in all of our sporting culture where we can prevent this injury from ever happening. And I would like to call out all of those sports organizations and say, you know better. It's time to do better.
Secondary prevention of a concussion is about developing strategies after an injury occurs. Although participation in sport does come with inherent risks surrounding accidents and injuries, sport governing bodies' role in mitigating these risks are often seen through the creation of codes of conduct, policy, and protocols.
We know that Injuries can happen in sports and accidents can happen anywhere. So it's important to understand what those protocols are and really preparing us for those kinds of codes of conduct where we talk about what's acceptable, what's not, and having an honest dialogue about the risks and what is a tolerable risk and what is not.
Understanding the critical role of sport governing bodies in establishing proper safety measures and guidelines is an essential aspect of preventing an injury like a concussion from happening in the first place. But in order to ensure we create these strategies properly, we must first gain a deeper understanding of the inherent risks associated with sport and how these risks are embedded in traditional sport culture that spans multiple generations.
We still have this sort of culture of risk and this culture of risk-taking that doesn't really align with this idea of keeping athletes safe. And sometimes that's pressures from coaches to perform. But it can be, it can be the athlete's own motivations too, because realistically in sport, at a lot of levels, that's what we value. We value performance. And so that comes with an inherent risk for getting concussions and then playing through said concussions.
The value of performance that Mike refers to is one of the biggest adversaries to concussion prevention, as athletes tend to believe struggle and enduring pain is a necessary part of attaining peak performance, which can create a problematic understanding of what it means to experience a concussion in sport.
On the same side, we're saying, well, don't push through that too much, but like you can here. So it's this kind of like tension that exists in sport where it's like, yeah, do this, but not that much. And then with concussions, the fact that it's invisible makes it even more complicated because nobody can see that. You can't measure that necessarily.
The challenge that comes with this invisible nature of a concussion Mike describes is that there is an element of self-diagnosis required for a concussion, and athletes may end up withholding information related to the symptoms they are experiencing as a result of how they are taught to endure through pain.
There's this thing called the pain principle, where athletes assume that when they're playing sport, they are going to endure pain. And so that can influence the way that they look at risks in sport because they're understanding that I am going to get hurt almost inevitably because I'm playing sport. And it's that inherent risk component that doesn't align with the concussion.
This acceptance of pain is often understood as the embodiment of the athlete identity. But as Ryan mentions, the complex nature of our brains doesn't align with this mentality, and playing through pain can be very harmful in the context of a concussion.
When athletes sustain a concussion, they treat it the same as any other injury. And so there's different considerations for a concussion because first and foremost, it is a brain injury. But secondly, it is invisible. Nobody can see it. Therefore, it's very hard to validate it. It's like, is this person really hurt or are they just faking it? Those are the type of things that can kind of come up when an athlete is being socialized to tough things out. So when an athlete actually sustains a concussion, they question what they're going through, they doubt their own injury, and then this can lead to mental health complications, this can lead to feeling of isolation. They become worried about what other people are going to think.
On top of this, there is an element of fear that can also be experienced throughout the recovery process. And this state of fear comes in different stages, each with the power to influence the decisions made by athletes.
So when an athlete's going back into play after sustaining a concussion, they're susceptible to a lot of forms of fear. Like when they're going back, they could be fearing re-injuring themselves.
There's often a shaken confidence that comes with injury and returning to sport. If people aren't feeling confident out there, they can really put themselves at risk of re-injury. A water skier who needs to go off a big jump, or a freestyle skier barreling down the hill, if they don't have their confidence and their skills back, that's pretty dangerous for that athlete or participant.
You also may be fearing losing your spot on your team. That's a very common one for people. So they actually want to get back to sports sooner and rush the return process because they are actually trying to get back to their position on the team or fulfill their role, so they aren't losing that kind of social element.
Hard to see all your friends having fun and you're kind of just like on the sidelines, just not able to do anything. So, and I'm very competitive, so not being able to like be on the ice and like be like, oh, I could do that, I could have done this for the team or that for the team was hard, definitely.
You get so excited because you can see the field, you're on the sidelines, like doing your return to play and stuff, and you see the girls out there like passing the ball and everything, and you just want to be part of it so bad.
Another source of fear is being perceived as weak by your peers. So what other people are thinking of you can actually dictate a lot of the concussion recovery, because you just want to be there with your teammates. You want to pretend like everything's normal because you look normal, right?
And you kind of get weird looks from other people of like, does she just not want to be here? Like, it's taking the easy way out type thing. But it's like knowing deep down that you can't be in that situation, and knowing what's better for long term.
You're seen as weak if you've got a headache and you've got a concussion and you can't go here, you can't go there. People kind of see it as weak.
Again, it's tied to mental health quite extensively, and this process where there's an internal conflict in that return to play process, it's very complex because mental health can be really intertwined with it as well.
My anxiety and depression started to take over, and I started to value that over my health, which was one of the biggest mistakes I made. But as a teenager, it was a really hard thing to choose my health first. So I did, unfortunately, I did tell doctors that I was feeling better and that I was ready to get back to hockey. So they cleared me, and I got hit again, and that was the end of any sport for me.
The nuances derived from fear plays a significant role in one's recovery journey, and it also adds to the overall complexities of creating preventative strategies once an athlete is confirmed to have sustained a concussion. Over the years, though, we have been able to create more proactive approaches based on research throughout the recovery stage.
In 2017, when the last consensus statement on concussion in sport was published, an updated gradual return to sport and return to school process was published with the document, and that really laid out the gradual approach that we use now.
Having a gradual return to activities has been proven to be very beneficial for concussion recovery, which means that the previous strategies we used to have in place for managing a concussion were actually counterintuitive to the healing process.
We have come a long way in our understanding of what helps support a person's recovery from their injury after concussion. Many people probably picture what we used to do, where people were sent to a dark room, some people call it bedroom jail, and thought the only way to support the brain was to let it rest kind of in the dark and in the quiet for days and potentially weeks on end. And what research has actually shown is only an initial period of rest is beneficial. After that, there is such thing as too much rest. For one thing, people become too still, too isolated. So it affects the ability of their brain to recover, but also, mentally and socially is not healthy for people to be isolated while they're recovering.
The unfortunate truth is that it often takes years for the research to catch up with the current standard of protocols being set at a national level. So even though we have made strides in our concussion prevention strategies, there's still a need for a more comprehensive approach that considers multiple aspects related to the individualistic nature of concussions.
I think one thing to note for anybody who is going through the return to play protocol is that as much it is a step-by-step basis, you have to acknowledge that it's a non-linear path to get through those steps. So it's not always going to be, I'm going to get through all of these in the timeline that I'm told. You don't know what the process is going to be like. It's very unique to each individual who sustains it.
What we want to avoid is people pushing too hard and kind of having this roller coaster of crashing and back down, but more so maintaining a level of activity where they can handle it.
To those who have sustained an injury and are wondering sort of what steps are next, it starts by telling someone. And so don't cut yourself off from your support systems. Obviously, consult with your doctor, consult with your parents or whoever is part of that sort of support network. We know now that return to play involves a little bit of activity once you kind of get through that acute phase and you start getting back into things, and that you can't do that from a room. But my advice would be not to cut yourself off.
Secondary prevention is about addressing the injury after it occurs. And to do that, we need to create evidence-based strategies that helps reduce the level of risk associated with re-injury, creating clear social reintegration pathways for athletes, programs built for athletes' mental health, support system education, and a proactive approach to an athlete's overall return to play pathway. The third and final stage of concussion prevention is known as tertiary prevention. This form of prevention emphasizes the potential for significant long-term consequences of sustaining a concussion. The reality is, experiencing any injury, especially a brain injury, can be devastating for people of all walks of life. So creating strategies to prevent such events from having long-term consequences is an integral part of the prevention process.
Injuries as a whole are a leading cause of death and hospitalization and disability in the country of Canada. So we're not talking about a minor issue, we're talking about significant public health issue that has impact on people's lives, their families, their communities, the healthcare professionals who take care of them. And so the best thing we can do is prevent these injuries from happening in the first place.
As Stephanie mentions, experiencing an injury is not something to take lightly. And in the context of sport, where we've already identified that there is an inherent risk in participation, understanding the long-term ramifications of sustaining a concussion can help reinforce a more health-driven value system in the next generation of athletes.
At the youth and the amateur level, we need to get away from that a little bit. And we have to say, you're a long-term athlete, you're a lifelong athlete, rather than let's just try and make the most of this particular moment, take whatever risks are necessary to it. Because that's so dangerous when it comes to someone's health.
For athletes who are currently participating in sport, instead of being so outcome-based, so focused on the end goal of the season, of that year, what they want to achieve within that specific area, if you are just looking at it from being an athlete for your whole life, imagine how different that perspective would be.
This perspective would not only change the way athletes view an injury, but also the conversations we have about concussions.
If I'm sitting here with a concussion, wanting to get back in, and you come to me and you say, well, why do you even want to play rugby? And it's like, well, I love this. I want to do this my whole life. It's like, well, do you think you can do that if you keep getting concussions?
Having more conversations like this with athletes can significantly reduce or even eliminate the risk of someone experiencing second impact syndrome. Although this sounds easy in principle to achieve, the common barrier that is often encountered is a lack of understanding around the severity of concussions.
Unfortunately, the thing that really educates kids about the injury is once they've lived through it themselves. And we need to do more, like we're doing here with PACA, in talking about those stories and having those hard conversations and having them understand that you could be playing a game that you love and you could get an injury that could change the trajectory of your life.
Preventing a concussion starts with all of us. Ask your school or sports organizations how they are helping prevent concussions and what supports they have in place for athletes who sustain one. We only get one brain. Treat it with the respect it deserves and reach out if you are struggling.
Just kind of taking the time, knowing that this is a journey that you're going to go through. And a lot of other people have gone through too, and just taking that time to rest and respect your body and know those symptoms and know that, again, sport will be there in the end, but it's not the end all be all. Like your life and how you treat yourself is really important too.
Understanding the important roles of recognizing, removing, managing, and preventing a concussion is essential for the recovery journey, and taking a proactive approach to these measures benefits everyone impacted by this invisible injury. If you think you might be experiencing some of the symptoms or notice that a friend is showing irregular signs of behavior, the best thing you can do is to seek help in your community and talk about it with someone. That is why the Peterborough Athletics Concussion Awareness Panel was put together, and it is their goal to set a new standard for communities when it comes to tackling concussions in Canada. To learn more about this community-led organization, you can visit www.paca.health for relevant resources and educational tools to help you understand this injury. And remember that you are not alone if you experience a concussion. We are all in this together.